The 1920s were the golden age of jazz. And while that era is associated with New Orleans and Harlem in the United States, jazz migrated north, and Montreal was the place to be. I'm Arizona O'Neill, a filmmaker in Montreal. Back in the Roaring 20s, Montreal was known as Sin City. Our seedy nightclubs made us a hot destination. Prohibition was the law of the land in the US, but in Montreal, the taps were still open. Many jazz musicians came to Montreal to party where the alcohol flowed. Unlike some elements of Montreal's past, Montreal's place in jazz history remains. It is no coincidence that we hold the largest jazz festival in the world, attended by 2 million people every summer. While we celebrate Montreal jazz icons like Oscar Peterson, Oliver Jones, and Maynard Ferguson, few of us know how their birthplace became a hotspot for jazz. And that story has been lost over time. It all began in Little Burgundy when most knew it as the St. Antoine District, sandwiched in between the Lachine Canal and downtown. Its nickname was Harlem of the North. The St. Antoine District was not far from the Canadian Pacific Railway, and in the 1800s, the American Pullman Company came to Montreal to manage sleeping and dining cars on Canadian railways. The company offered one of the few jobs available for black men in Canada at the time, hiring them to attend to railway passengers' every need. They were called sleeping car porters. Black Americans came north for work, as well as Canadians from Nova Scotia and men from the Caribbean, such as jazz virtuoso Oscar Peterson's father. They were put up in boarding houses on St. Antoine Street close to the train station. Eventually, wives, families, and girlfriends joined the men, and this migration proved to be significant in shaping Montreal's culture. As the Black community established itself in the St. Antoine District, people started opening businesses, and families started moving westward towards Mountain and Guy Street. It took decades to break the unwritten rules that made it next to impossible for Black families to enter the Montreal housing market. But by half a century after the arrival of the first sleeping car porters, St. Antoine Street had become one of the most lively and fun strips in the city. In the 1920s, Montreal's red light district dominated downtown, and the St. Antoine district was just south of this, and it had a nightlife of its own. The nightclubs there had a different atmosphere from the glitz and glamour of the downtown clubs, which were full of bands playing radio-style tunes. Down on St. Antoine Street, musicians were encouraged to come and jam and try new things, something that musicians loved. This encouraged a swing style that was jazzier and more laid back. Musicians would perform their regular gigs for the Golden Mile crowds, then hit St. Antoine Street looking for a jazz club to play to their heart's desire. Kind of like going out after work. These clubs were fun, and the music was on another level. Even Louis Armstrong went down to Rockheads Paradise after performing at the Montreal Forum to put on his real show. Rockheads Paradise was one of the most celebrated clubs in the city. Louis Armstrong was not the only American jazz legend to perform there, so did Billie Holiday, Nina Simone, and Sammy Davis Jr. Famously, Ella Fitzgerald made her Montreal debut there in 1943. And Rockheads is where local talents such as Oscar Peterson and Oliver Jones got their start. Rockheads Paradise was the first Black-owned club in the city. Rufus Rockhead, a Jamaican-born immigrant and a former railroad porter, opened it in 1928. Rockhead didn't buy the building with his porter wages, however. During his 8 years with the railway, the Prohibition years, he worked the bootleg business smuggling alcohol from Montreal to Chicago. And that's how he saved up for his dream. The nightclub was a gorgeous 3-story red brick building located on the corner of Mountain and St. Antoine Street. On the first floor was a cocktail bar where jazz musicians jammed. On the second floor was a cabaret with a raised stage. From there you went down a corridor and climbed the stairs to the third floor mezzanine and watched the performers below. Rockheads Paradise mirrored the great nightclubs of Harlem, with their chorus lines of black dancers. It was something new in the city. It was exciting. It attracted white audiences looking for livelier parties than the ones uptown. Rufus Rockhead himself said that the big shots would come down the hill to see his shows. Before that, few white visitors would step foot in the neighborhood, let alone party there. These little burgundy clubs were breaking down barriers. But of course, as a businessman, Rufus Rockhead did not have it easy. Just getting a liquor license was inconceivable since the city would not give permits to people of color. To this day, no one understands how Rockhead managed to acquire that license. Or at least, no one is talking. Rockhead also managed to keep his business open through the 1940s and 1950s, through the infamous years of iron-fisted Premier Maurice Duplessis, and through the early 60s despite the efforts of Mayor Jean Drapeau to clean up Montreal. But slowly, Rockheads Paradise lost its magic as the Saint Antoine district slipped into decline. It closed its doors for good in 1977. The 60s ushered in the era of the single-family car, and passenger trains were no longer popular. With fewer jobs for porters, many black men lost their jobs. High unemployment made the community vulnerable, and the city administration under Jean Drapeau took advantage of that. Drapeau had a vision, and Little Burgundy was not part of it. The mayor built a highway straight through the neighborhood. This was to help commuters from the suburbs drive downtown. Now you can't tell me that the construction of the Ville-Marie Expressway wasn't a deliberate attack on the city's black population. The highway was built through the northern half of the neighborhood, where most of the black population lived and worked. This was known as urban renewal. When I dig into erased histories in Montreal, it often comes back to targeted urban renewal, just as they did with Griffintown and nearly succeeded with Chinatown. The urban planners of the 1960s erased entire neighborhoods in the name of modernization. They did so without considering or acknowledging the history of those neighborhoods or their cultural importance. The Saint Antoine district was cast as a slum and designated a pilot zone for urban renewal. It was to be called Petit Bourgogne or Little Burgundy. That's right. They even took away the name of the neighborhood. The city report used to justify the demolition made no mention of race. No mention of the black residents, the institutions, Rufus Rockhead, or Oscar Peterson. Not a word about the jazz era that helped shape our city. The neighborhood was renewed with the highest concentration of public housing in the province, and many black families still living there were displaced. There is no architectural marker left for us to celebrate Montreal jazz in Little Burgundy. Now, where Rockheads Paradise once stood is the Tour des Canadiens 3, a bleak condominium tower. Montreal appropriated the extraordinary art that came from this neighborhood without giving the creators and the places they lived and worked their due. The best we can do now is talk about these histories and why they were forcibly erased, so that hopefully we can stop it from happening again. Urban renewal is a dangerous term that is often used to disguise racial and discriminatory policies. Stay vigilant. For CBC, the Creator Network, I'm Arizona O'Neill.
So jazz.